The rails through the desert. Historical context. Picture, if you will, the American Southwest as it existed in the year 1910. This was a land still raw with frontier energy, still dangerous in its beauty, still unforgiving to those who underestimated its power. The great age of railroad construction was reaching its zenith, that remarkable era when human ambition carved pathways through terrain that had defeated every attempt at civilization before. From the copper mines of Arizona to the agricultural valleys of California, from the cattle ranches of New Mexico to the port of San Diego, railroad lines were being pushed, pulled, and sometimes forced through landscapes that seemed designed by nature to resist such intrusions. The El Paso and Southwestern Railroad, which began its life in 1888 as the humble Arizona and Southeastern Railroad, had by 1910 grown into a 1,200-mile system that connected Tucumcari, New Mexico, to El Paso, Texas, and reached westward to Tucson, Arizona. This wasn't merely a railroad. It was a lifeline built by copper interests who understood that without rails, there or would remain forever trapped in the mountains. The Phelps Dodge Corporation, that mighty mining concern, had recognized what many others before them had learned, sometimes fatally: the desert yields its riches only to those who can transport them. The construction of these lines represented engineering challenges that would make modern project managers blanch. Consider the conditions these men faced. Summer temperatures in the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts routinely exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Water was scarce, sometimes non-existent for stretches of 50 miles or more. The ground itself seemed hostile, shifting from hard pan that dulled tools within hours to loose sand that swallowed tracks and required constant maintenance. Flash floods could appear from cloudless skies, the result of storms 50 miles distant, turning dry washes into roaring torrents that undermined roadbeds and swept away months of work in minutes. And yet they built. Chinese laborers, Irish immigrants, Mexican workers, Native Americans from nearby reservations all came together in those temporary construction camps that moved like slow-motion avalanches across the landscape. The demographics of these crews tell their own story of America's complicated relationship with labor and race. By 1910, Mexican workers, known as troqueros, constituted nearly two-thirds of the track labor force in the Southwest. They had become indispensable to the railroad industry, taking on the backbreaking work of laying rail, driving spikes, and maintaining the endless miles of track that required constant attention. The year 1910 was particularly significant in the history of Southwestern railroads. It was the year that James Douglas, head of the Phelps Dodge Corporation, announced plans to make Tucson the western terminus of the El Paso and Southwestern Railroad. It was a year when the San Diego and Arizona Railway finally reached the Mexican border, culminating years of construction through the impossible Carrizo Gorge. It was a year of promise and expansion, but also a year shadowed by the gathering storm of the Mexican Revolution, which would soon send shockwave through the borderlands and disrupt the labor force that kept the trains running. The Southern Pacific Railroad, that giant of Western transportation, had its own extensive network through the desert regions. Its main line ran from El Paso through Deming and Lordsburg in New Mexico, then across southern Arizona through Wilcox, Tucson, and Yuma, before reaching California. This was the route that carried passengers and freight across what had once been called, somewhat melodramatically, but not entirely inaccurately, the Great American Desert. The transformation of this perceived wasteland into productive territory was due in large measure to the railroads themselves, which lowered transportation costs so dramatically that farming, ranching, and mining could finally be conducted at a profit. The Santa Fe Railway, officially the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, had its own impressive presence in the Southwest by 1910. Its route from New Mexico to the Pacific had been completed at the dawn of the 20th century, employing hundreds of Navajo trackmen for the manual labor of laying rails. The Santa Fe became famous not just for its transportation services, but for its cultural impact, working with the Fred Harvey Company to create a network of hotels and restaurants that made desert travel not merely bearable, but, for wealthy tourists, downright luxurious. But it's important to understand that for every passenger in a Fred Harvey dining room, sipping coffee and admiring Native American crafts, there were dozens of men working in conditions that would today be considered inhumane. The construction camps were rough places, attracting all manner of characters, from honest laborers seeking a stake to confidence men looking for easy marks. Life in these camps was crude, dangerous, and often short. Accidents were common. Disease was rampant. The heat alone killed men who pushed themselves too hard or underestimated the desert's ability to extract every drop of moisture from a human body. The section houses that dotted the rail lines every 10 to 15 miles were remnants of this construction era, transformed into permanent stations for maintenance crews. These structures served multiple purposes. They were homes for section foremen and their families, if they had them. They were storage facilities for tools and equipment. They were communication nodes equipped with telegraph equipment and, later, telephones. Most importantly, they were guard posts, places where men stood watch over the steel arteries that carried the lifeblood of commerce through an environment that never stopped trying to reclaim what humans had taken. Understanding the architecture of these section houses helps us appreciate both their functionality and their limitations. Most were built to standardize plans developed by railroad engineering departments, modified slightly to account for regional conditions, but fundamentally similar whether located in Arizona or New Mexico, Nevada, or California. The typical design called for a rectangular structure, usually between 400 and 800 square feet of interior space, divided into functional zones that reflected the priorities of the railroad company rather than the comfort needs of occupants. The construction materials varied, depending on what was locally available and what the railroad's budget allowed. In forested regions, section houses might be built entirely of wood, with proper timber framing and plank siding. But in the desert Southwest, where trees were scarce and expensive to transport, construction often relied on a hybrid approach. Minimal wood framing supported by locally quarried stone or adobe brick for walls, with corrugated metal roofing that could withstand the region's infrequent but violent storms. The roofs were typically steeply pitched despite the low rainfall, a design element borrowed from wetter regions and maintained through institutional inertia rather than local necessity. Windows were small and few, a concession to the reality that large openings in walls created more problems than benefits in desert environments. Glass had to be transported carefully to avoid breakage. Screens were essential to keep out insects and dust, but were difficult to maintain, and large windows admitted heat during summer months far more readily than they provided light or ventilation. The typical section house might have 4 to 6 small windows, strategically placed to provide cross-ventilation when conditions allowed, but minimally exposed to direct sunlight during the hottest parts of the day. The interior arrangement followed a logical progression from public to private space, though the very concept of privacy was somewhat aspirational in structures this small. Entering through the main door, which always faced the railroad tracks for security and visibility reasons, one found oneself in the combination work and living space. This room contained whatever furniture the occupant could acquire or build, typically a rough-hewn table, a few chairs, shelves mounted to the walls, and perhaps a small desk for paperwork. The room's center was dominated by a cast-iron stove, which served multiple purposes, cooking, heating in winter, and often simply as a gathering point that gave the room a focal center. Adjacent to this main room was the sleeping quarter, usually separated only by a curtain or a partial wall rather than a proper door. Privacy was a luxury that section house design didn't accommodate. The sleeping area contained a cot or simple bed frame, perhaps a trunk for personal belongings, hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. Some occupants managed to install a small mirror, an item that seemed frivolous, but that helped maintain some connection to civilized self-regard in circumstances that encouraged letting such concerns slip away. The third functional area, sometimes a separate small room, but often just a partitioned section of the main space, was dedicated to tools and railroad equipment. Here were stored the specialized implements required for track maintenance, heavy wrenches for adjusting rail bolts, sledgehammers for driving spikes, pry bars for shifting rails, measuring devices for checking gauge and alignment. The telegraph equipment, when present, occupied pride of place in this area, mounted on a sturdy shelf with battery storage beneath and the necessary wiring running to poles outside that connected to the main telegraph line. Sanitation facilities were rudimentary at best. Most section houses had no indoor plumbing whatsoever. Occupants relieved themselves in outhouses located a discrete distance from the main structure, walked there regardless of weather or time of day. Bathing was accomplished through a combination of ingenuity and resignation, usually involving a basin for sponge baths or, for the more ambitious, some arrangement of hanging buckets and canvas screens that created a makeshift shower. In winter, heating the water required time and fuel that competed with other needs. In summer, the challenge was finding water that wasn't already unpleasantly warm from sitting in exposed tanks. By 1910, the basic infrastructure of southwestern railroads was in place, but the work of maintenance never ended. Rails expanded and contracted with temperature changes of 40 degrees or more between day and night. Sand and dust infiltrated every mechanism. Flash floods undermined roadbeds. Even in areas where rainfall averaged only 8 inches per year, water damage was a constant threat because when rain did come, it came with biblical fury. Maintenance crews, often composed largely of Mexican workers who lived in converted boxcars clustered near section houses, moved continuously along their assigned stretches of track, replacing ties, adjusting rails, clearing debris. The political situation added its own complications. The Mexican Revolution, which erupted in 1910, created chaos along the border. Labor supplies became unreliable. Some workers returned to Mexico to fight. Others fled north to escape the violence. The railroads, dependent on this labor force, had to adapt quickly, hiring whoever they could find and sometimes operating with skeleton crews. The year 1911 saw a particular disruption when revolutions and counter-revolutions swept through northern Mexico, causing Mexican laborers to abandon their jobs en masse before eventually returning when the immediate crisis passed. Into this complex world of industrial ambition, ethnic diversity, political upheaval, and environmental hostility, individual men were inserted to serve as the human components of a vast mechanical system. They were section foremen and assistant foremen, track walkers and switch operators, water station attendants, and crossing watchmen. They lived in isolation, sometimes seeing no one but passing train crews for weeks at a time. They endured heat that could kill in hours and cold that froze water in canteens. They watched for dangers that could appear in seconds: a washed-out section of track, a displaced rail, a boulder rolled down from the hills by some seismic shiver or erosive moment. These men were the nervous system of the railroad, the sensory organs that detected problems before they could become catastrophes. Without them, the trains that carried copper and cattle, passengers and mail, supplies and hopes across the desert would have been running blind through one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Their stories are largely unrecorded. They weren't executives making grand decisions in comfortable offices. They weren't passengers writing letters home about their adventures. They were working men doing dangerous, exhausting, monotonous work in places where mistakes meant death, and success meant merely that tomorrow you would do the same thing again. Yet their contributions were essential. Every train that crossed the desert without incident represented countless hours of vigilance by these watchers of the rails. Every passenger who arrived safely at their destination owed a debt they would never know to men they would never meet. The transformation of the Southwest from frontier to settled region was built on steel rails. Yes, but those rails were guarded, maintained, and protected by human beings who chose, for reasons of their own, to make the desert their domain and the railroad their purpose. The life of a railroad watchman. To understand the life of a railroad watchman in 1910, you must first strip away every comfort and convenience of modern existence. Imagine living in a small wooden structure, perhaps 20 feet by 30 feet if you were lucky, sitting alone in a landscape that stretched empty to every horizon. Your nearest neighbor might be the section foreman's house 10 miles up the line, or the next water station 15 miles back. Towns were distant dreams, reachable only by flagging down a train and hoping the conductor would make an unscheduled stop, which you would do only if you deemed your need sufficient. The section house where a watchman lived was functional rather than comfortable. Built by the railroad company to standardized designs that varied somewhat by region and era, these structures typically included a room for tool storage, a small living space, and perhaps a separate area for telegraph or telephone equipment. Construction was basic, wood frame with tar paper or simple siding, designed to withstand the weather but not to provide luxury. In summer, these buildings became ovens, radiating the day's accumulated heat long into the night. In winter, they were drafty boxes that required constant attention to the wood stove to maintain livable temperatures. Water was the dominating concern of daily life. Unlike the towns and cities where residents could turn a tap and expect fresh water to flow, the desert watchman had to manage a supply with the meticulousness of a ship's captain at sea. Most section houses had a cistern or tank that was filled periodically by the railroad company, water hauled in on special water cars that made regular runs along the line. A watchman might receive a resupply once a week or once every 2 weeks, depending on his location and the railroad schedule. This water had to serve all purposes: drinking, cooking, washing, and maintaining hygiene. It had to be protected from evaporation in summer and from freezing in winter. It had to be rationed with a careful eye toward the calendar and the railroad's reliability in keeping its supply promises. The science of water management in the desert became second nature to experienced watchmen, a complex calculus that balanced immediate needs against future uncertainties. A gallon of water weighs just over 8 pounds, a fact that becomes intimately familiar when you're carrying it from cistern to house. An adult human requires, at minimum, about a gallon per day for drinking in moderate conditions, but in the Southwest summer heat, that requirement could easily double or triple. Add to this the water needed for cooking. Most foods require some liquid in their preparation. For washing hands and face to maintain basic hygiene, for cleaning cooking utensils to prevent disease, for dampening cloths that could be draped over windows to provide evaporative cooling, and the daily consumption quickly mounted to alarming levels. Experienced watchmen developed elaborate systems for water conservation that would impress modern environmentalists. The water used for washing vegetables or rice would be carefully saved and used afterward for washing dishes. That same water, now containing traces of food and soap, would then be used to dampen the ground around any garden plants, providing both moisture and minimal nutrients. Water that had been used for drinking after it had sat in a cup overnight and accumulated dust might be used to rinse the mouth in the morning rather than being discarded. Every drop had potential value, and wasting water was not just impractical, but almost immoral, a violation of the desert's harsh lessons about scarcity and survival. The cisterns themselves required constant monitoring and maintenance. Most were constructed of galvanized steel or, in older installations, wood lined with tar or other waterproofing materials. They sat elevated on wooden or metal stands, allowing gravity to provide pressure for a spigot at the base. But elevation also meant exposure to sunlight, which heated the water to temperatures that made it unpleasant for drinking and accelerated evaporation through any imperfections in the tank ceiling. Some watchmen wrapped their cisterns in burlap sacks kept damp through careful application of water, creating evaporative cooling that lowered the temperature of the stored supply by 10 or 15 degrees, a technique borrowed from Spanish and Mexican traditions going back centuries. Contamination was an ever-present concern. Desert dust, fine as flour and seemingly capable of penetrating any barrier, would work its way into water supplies despite the most careful precautions. Insects, drawn to water like pilgrims to a shrine, would find their way into tanks and cisterns, drowning and decomposing, potentially introducing disease. Birds would perch on tank edges and contaminate supplies with their droppings. Small mammals, desperately seeking moisture, would occasionally fall into open storage containers and die, their bodies rotting in the very substance their thirst had drawn them toward. Watchmen learned to filter their water through layers of cloth, to boil it when fuel was available, to add small amounts of chemicals like potassium permanganate that could kill bacteria without making the water entirely undrinkable. The water delivery schedule was theoretically regular but practically unpredictable. A water car was supposed to visit each section house on a predetermined day each week or fortnight, pumping fresh supplies into cisterns from the car's large tank. But equipment failures, scheduling conflicts, emergencies on other sections of track, and simple bureaucratic oversights could delay deliveries without warning. A watchman who expected resupply on Tuesday might find himself still waiting on Friday, his carefully managed reserves declining toward dangerous levels, his calculations about rationing becoming increasingly urgent and pessimistic. Some section houses were located near natural water sources, springs, or seasonal streams that could supplement railroad-delivered supplies. But these sources came with their own complications. Desert springs often contained dissolved minerals and concentrations that made them unsafe for regular drinking. Alkali compounds that could sicken or kill if consumed in sufficient quantities. Seasonal streams might be reliable in winter and spring, but completely dry for months at a time, making them useless precisely when water was most desperately needed. And even when water sources appeared reliable, there was always the question of what else might be using them. Whether mineral deposits or biological contamination made them dangerous despite their superficial appearance of clean, flowing freshness. The watchman's daily routine began before dawn, not because of any arbitrary schedule, but because the desert itself demanded it. The hours between first light and mid-morning were the only time when physical work could be performed without risking heat exhaustion. A typical morning would begin with a walk along the section of track assigned to the watchman's care. This wasn't a casual stroll, but a methodical inspection, eyes scanning for any sign of trouble. Were the rails properly aligned? Had the desert wind blown sand across the tracks during the night? Were there any fresh cracks in the ties? Had animals disturbed the roadbed? Had recent temperature changes caused the rails to expand or contract in ways that might create dangerous stress points? This morning inspection might cover anywhere from 2 to 5 miles of track, depending on the terrain and the watchman's assessment of risk factors. In areas prone to flooding, he would check the condition of culverts and drainage systems. In mountainous regions, he would look for signs of rock falls or erosion. In open desert, he would search for evidence of wind damage or animal intrusion. Every discrepancy had to be noted, evaluated, and either corrected immediately if minor, or reported if it required assistance from a full maintenance crew. After the morning walk, the watchman would return to his section house for breakfast, a meal that was usually simple and repetitive. Supplies came from whatever he could receive by mail order or purchase during infrequent trips to town. Canned goods formed the backbone of the diet. Beans, tinned meat, dried fruit, hardtack, or other preserved bread products. Fresh food was a luxury available only when the garden patch some watchmen maintained yielded something edible, which was a constant battle against the desert's determination to support only what it chose to support. Water for cooking had to be used sparingly, which ruled out dishes that required boiling or extensive washing of ingredients. The heat of midday forced a suspension of outdoor activities. This was the time when the watchman retreated to whatever shade he could create or find, drinking water carefully, resting in preparation for the afternoon. Some men used this time to maintain their equipment, sharpening tools, mending clothes, writing letters that might or might not find their way to recipients. Others simply endured, finding what comfort they could in the knowledge that evening would eventually come and bring with it at least the illusion of relief. The telegraph or telephone, if the section house possessed such equipment, was both a blessing and a burden. It connected the watchman to the wider world of the railroad, allowing him to report problems, receive instructions, and learn when trains were approaching his section. But it also meant he was on call at all hours, expected to respond immediately to any message that came clicking or ringing through. Train dispatchers dozens or hundreds of miles away could reach into his isolated existence at any moment, demanding information or action without any understanding of or concern for his local conditions. Communication with passing trains was another crucial element of the watchman's duties. As trains approached, he would position himself trackside, ready to signal any problems or to receive messages from the crew. The system of hand signals used by railroaders was a language unto itself, evolved over decades to allow communication in conditions where shouted words were lost in the roar of engines and the rush of wind. A raised arm meant stop. A waved lantern after dark meant danger. A thumbs up indicated all was well. These simple gestures carried enormous weight because a misunderstood signal could lead to disaster. The isolation of the job attracted a certain type of man, or perhaps it created him. Watchmen tended to be self-sufficient, comfortable with solitude, able to endure monotony without losing their edge. They were often men with troubled pasts or uncertain futures, people for whom the desert's emptiness was preferable to the complications of civilization. Some were veterans of foreign wars or frontier conflicts, carrying physical or psychological scars that made the isolation seem like sanctuary rather than exile. Others were simply pragmatists who understood that steady employment, even in harsh conditions, was preferable to uncertainty elsewhere. The ethnic diversity of railroad workers extended to watchmen as well, though to a lesser degree than among track crews. Mexican men often served as watchmen on lines near the border, their familiarity with desert survival giving them advantages that Eastern-born workers lacked. Native Americans, particularly from tribes like the Navajo who had generations of experience with the Southwest challenges, sometimes found employment as watchmen, though prejudice and policy often restricted them to lower-paying positions despite their superior qualifications. White workers from varied backgrounds filled other positions, brought west by economic necessity or wanderlust, staying because they discovered they had aptitudes they hadn't known they possessed. Relations between watchmen and other railroad employees followed the complex hierarchies of industrial labor. Section foremen, who supervised maintenance crews and had authority over several watchmen, were typically white men, often with previous railroad experience in less demanding regions. The actual maintenance work was performed by section gangs, frequently composed primarily of Mexican workers who lived in converted boxcars that could be moved along the line as work demanded. Chinese laborers, who had been instrumental in building the transcontinental railroads, were by 1910 less common in the Southwest, replaced by Mexican workers who commanded lower wages and were seen as more easily controlled. The introduction of different ethnic groups to railroad work had followed patterns of exploitation and prejudice that characterized the era. Around 1900, the Santa Fe Railroad had experimented with bringing in Japanese workers, paying them less than $1 per day to displace what were considered overpaid Indian workers. When this proved unsatisfactory, the railroad returned to its previous labor arrangements, having successfully depressed wages across the board through the threat of replacement. Such tactics created tensions among workers even as they shared the hardships of desert labor. Women's presence in this masculine world was limited but not absent. Some section foremen brought their wives to section houses, women who endured isolation even more complete than their husbands. While the men had their work routines and interactions with train crews, wives often went weeks without seeing another woman, spending their days maintaining households under conditions that would have defeated most people. They tended gardens that usually failed. They cooked in temperatures that turned kitchens into chambers of torture. They raised children in environments with no schools, no doctors, no playmates except perhaps the lizards and rabbits that ventured near human habitation. The resilience of these women goes largely unrecorded, but their presence made it possible for some men to endure postings that would otherwise have driven them to quit or to madness. The dangers of Watchman life were both dramatic and mundane. Yes, there was always the possibility of a catastrophic failure, a train derailment caused by missed track damage, a collision resulting from a communication error, a flash flood that swept away section house and Watchman together. But the more common dangers were slower and more insidious. Heat exhaustion could creep up on even experienced desert dwellers, symptoms progressing from mild discomfort to life-threatening distress in the time it took to walk a mile of track under the midday sun. Dehydration was a constant threat, the body's water reserves depleting invisibly until suddenly coordination failed, vision dimmed, confusion set in, and death approached with surprising speed. Loneliness, too, was a danger, though one less acknowledged in an era that valued stoicism and emotional restraint. Months of isolation could erode a man's connection to humanity, making the voices on the Telegraph seem less real than the voices in his head, making the passage of trains seem like dreams, making reality itself seem negotiable. Some men handled this admirably, finding peace in solitude and meaning in their duties. Others slowly unraveled, their grip on sanity loosening like the grip of fingers that had held on too long to something too heavy to bear. The compensation for this life was modest. Watchmen earned wages that varied by railroad and region, but typically amounted to somewhere between $40 and $60 per month in 1910, roughly equivalent to $1,100 to $1,600 in modern terms. This was enough to live on, barely, if one had no dependents and few needs. It was enough to save money, slowly, if one was disciplined and lucky. It was not enough to grow wealthy or even comfortable. But for men who had known true poverty or who valued independence over prosperity, it was sufficient. Some watchmen served for years, becoming fixtures of their sections, known to every train crew that passed through, respected for their reliability and endurance. Others lasted only months before the desert defeated them, or they defeated themselves through carelessness or drink or simple inability to endure. The turnover rate was high enough that railroads maintained lists of potential replacements, men willing to step into positions that became vacant when current occupants quit, died, or disappeared into the desert never to return. Equipment maintenance was another consuming aspect of the job. Tools had to be kept in working order despite the desert's best efforts to ruin them. Sand worked its way into every mechanism, grinding metal against metal until failure seemed inevitable. Heat expanded and contracted materials, creating stress fractures and weaknesses that appeared without warning. Moisture, when it came, brought rust and corrosion, attacking steel with almost vindictive efficiency. A watchman who neglected his tools would soon find himself unable to perform the basic tasks of track maintenance, leaving him dependent on the section crew for problems he should have been able to handle alone. The rhythm of the railroad defined time in ways that clocks and calendars could not. Trains passed at scheduled intervals, their approach announced by the distant sound of whistles echoing across empty spaces, their passage marking segments of the day more reliably than the sun's movement across the sky. A watchman learned the schedule with precision, knew without consulting papers when a morning freight should appear around the eastern curve, when the afternoon passenger train would come thundering past, when the evening copper ore train would labor westward toward the smelters. Any deviation from this schedule was cause for concern, a potential indication of trouble somewhere along the line. Nights brought their own challenges and consolations. The desert's temperature plunged after sunset, sometimes dropping 40 degrees, or more between day's height and the hour before dawn. What had been unbearable heat became cold that seeped through inadequate walls and warm blankets. But the cooling also brought relief, permission to breathe deeply without feeling like the air itself was an enemy. Nights brought sounds that the daytime's heat seemed to suppress, the calls of nightbirds and the rustle of creatures emerging to hunt or feed. Nights brought stars in profusion unknown to those who lived where artificial light dimmed the heavens, constellations so brilliant and numerous that a man could believe he was looking not up but out, seeing across distances that made his isolation seem trivial by comparison. Some watchmen read by lamplight, working through whatever books they could acquire, creating mental worlds far removed from their physical circumstances. Others maintained journals, recording observations about weather and wildlife, train times and track conditions, creating records that sometimes survived to become valuable historical documents. Still others simply sat in darkness, listening to the night, watching the stars wheel overhead, finding meditation in the silence that had driven others to desperation. The relationship between a watchman and his section of track could become almost mystical. After months or years of walking the same miles, inspecting the same features, feeling the same patterns of sun and wind and temperature, a man could develop an almost supernatural sensitivity to change. A boulder that had always been 10 feet from the tracks, but was now 9 feet, drew immediate attention. A tie that showed slightly more weathering than its neighbors became a focus of concern. The angle of light on the rails at a particular time of day could reveal stresses and strains that would be invisible under different illumination. This intimate knowledge of terrain and structure made experienced watchmen invaluable, their expertise impossible to replicate through any amount of formal training. The man at mile marker 247, our particular watchman, whose story we're following tonight, had been at his post for 3 years when our narrative begins. He'd arrived in the summer of 1907, replacing a man who had simply vanished one day, walked away from his section house into the desert, and never returned. Whether that predecessor had died of exposure or escaped to some new life was unknown and ultimately unimportant to the railroad company, which cared only that the position be filled and the duties performed. The watchman, whom we'll call Thomas because he deserved a name even if his real one has been lost to history, was 34 years old in the summer of 1910. He'd grown up in Missouri, left home at 17 for reasons he never discussed, worked cattle ranches in Texas, prospected unsuccessfully for silver in New Mexico, and finally drifted into railroad work because it was steady and because he'd grown tired of moving. The section house at mile marker 247 became, improbably, the closest thing to a home he'd known since childhood. The location of his post was typical of many such installations along the El Paso and Southwestern line. The section house sat on a slight rise, perhaps 200 yards from the tracks, positioned to offer a clear view in both directions along the line. Behind it, to the north, rose the Dos Cabezas Mountains, their twin peaks giving the range its name. Their slopes a jumble of weathered granite and scattered vegetation clinging to existence in cracks and crevices. To the south, the desert stretched away toward Mexico, a rolling plain of creosote bush and ocotillo broken by dry washes and occasional outcrops of rock. The nearest water source, aside from his cistern, was a seasonal spring 7 miles into the mountains, accessible only by rough trail and reliable only in winter and early spring. The nearest town was Wilcox, 30 miles to the west, a sprawling settlement that served as a division point for the railroad and a supply center for surrounding ranches. Thomas visited Wilcox perhaps 4 times a year, trips that required either flagging down a train or undertaking a day-long journey on the mule he kept in a small corral behind the section house. His section house was painted a faded yellow, a color chosen by some distant bureaucrat who had probably never seen the desert and didn't understand that yellow siding would reflect heat like a mirror aimed at an unsuspecting victim. The structure measured 24 feet by 30 feet, divided into 3 rooms, a combined living space and kitchen, a bedroom barely large enough for a cot and a trunk, and a tool storage area that doubled as a telegraph room. The telegraph equipment, installed 2 years before Thomas's arrival, connected him to the wider railroad network and represented his most important link to civilization beyond the trains that passed his post. Thomas had made modest attempts to personalize his dwelling. A small garden plot on the shaded side of the building produced, with varying success, tomatoes and peppers that could tolerate the heat. He'd built a crude shower using a perforated bucket hung from a frame, a luxury that allowed him to rinse away some of each day's accumulation of dust and sweat. Inside, the walls were decorated with images clipped from magazines, landscapes of green forests and flowing rivers, scenes as foreign to his daily reality as if they depicted life on another planet. His daily routine had become so ingrained that he could perform most tasks without conscious thought. Wake before dawn. Perform morning ablutions with carefully measured water. Eat breakfast of coffee, hardtack, and whatever preserved food was available. Set out for the morning track inspection, carrying water bottle, tool kit, and notepad. Walk the 3 miles eastward to the boundary of his section, inspecting every tie, every rail joint, every switch and signal. Return to the section house by mid-morning before the heat became dangerous. Spend midday hours in whatever shade could be found, maintaining equipment, responding to telegraph messages, resting in preparation for the afternoon. As the day's heat began to fade, a second inspection, this time westward to the other boundary of his section. Return by sunset. Prepare a simple evening meal. Sit outside if the weather permitted, watching the mountains turn purple in the gathering dusk, listening to the silence that was never quite silent, disturbed always by wind and the calls of creatures and the occasional distant whistle of a train on some parallel section of track. Sleep when exhaustion overcame restlessness, which some nights came quickly and other nights seemed unwilling to arrive at all. Thomas's relationship with the trains that passed his section was complex. On one hand, they were intrusions, roaring monsters that shattered the desert's peace with their mechanical violence. On the other hand, they were connections to the world beyond, each one carrying people and goods and possibilities that had nothing to do with him, but which reminded him that he was part of something larger than his own isolation. He recognized many of the train crews by sight, new engineers who would sound their whistle in greeting as they passed, understood conductors who would throw newspapers or magazines down to him if they happened to have extras. The passengers were glimpses of other lives, faces in windows that appeared and vanished in seconds, people traveling from somewhere to somewhere else with no knowledge that a man stood watching their passage. Occasionally passengers would wave, usually children delighted by the novelty of seeing a solitary figure in the empty landscape. Thomas would wave back, a gesture that seemed both meaningless and profoundly significant, a momentary connection between his stationary existence and their mobile one. The landscape itself became a companion of sorts. Thomas learned its moods, the way dawn light transformed the mountains from black silhouettes to three-dimensional forms of surprising complexity. He noted which species of birds frequented which locations and at what seasons. He observed the subtle changes in vegetation across different elevations and soil types. He tracked the movement of deer herds and the patterns of javelina families that sometimes ventured close to his section house in early morning or late evening. He became familiar with specific rocks and cacti, gave them names in his mind, checked on them during his walks like visiting old friends. Weather, in a region where weather was supposed to be predictable to the point of monotony, became a subject of endless fascination. The subtleties of cloud formation could predict the arrival of rare rain days in advance. The behavior of animals often signaled changes in barometric pressure before any human senses detected them. The quality of light could indicate dust storms approaching from hundreds of miles away, giving precious hours of warning before walls of particulate matter arrive to scour exposed surfaces and infiltrate every shelter. Thomas's water management demonstrated the kind of discipline that separated survivors from casualties in the desert. His cistern held approximately 500 gallons when full, enough for perhaps 3 weeks of normal use. But Thomas never allowed himself normal use. He rationed every drop, using the same water multiple times for different purposes. Water for washing vegetables would be used afterward to rinse dishes, then to water his garden plants, finally to settle dust around the section house. Drinking water was kept separate and sacred, stored in covered containers that protected it from evaporation and contamination. He learned the hard way about the importance of this discipline. During his first summer at the post, he'd been less careful, assuming that the railroad supply train would always arrive on schedule. When that train was delayed by a derailment on another section of track, Thomas found himself with 3 days' worth of water and a week to wait until the next scheduled delivery. Those days taught him lessons about thirst and heat and the thin margin between comfort and crisis that he never forgot. The isolation of his position had effects both subtle and obvious. His spoken voice, used so rarely, had developed a roughness from disuse. When he did speak, often to himself or to the mule, his words came slowly, as if his brain had to rediscover how to form sentences after long periods of internal silence. His sense of time had become elastic, days blending together into undifferentiated stretches, punctuated only by the passage of trains and the movement of the sun. Weeks could pass in what seemed like moments, while single hours during the midday heat could stretch into eternities. But he'd also developed compensating skills and perceptions. His hearing had become acute, able to detect the approach of trains long before they came into view, distinguishing by sound alone whether the engine was laboring under heavy load or running light. His vision had adapted to scanning vast distances, picking out details that would escape urban eyes accustomed to focusing on nearby objects. His sense of smell had become sensitive to changes in the air that might indicate approaching weather or the presence of animals, or the subtle variations in desert vegetation that signaled water beneath the surface. His possessions were few and treasured. A good pocket watch, which he wound with ritualistic precision each evening. A serviceable rifle, kept more for the comfort of its presence than from any genuine expectation of needing it. A collection of books accumulated through mail order and gifts from train crews, volumes whose pages he'd read until the words were memorized, but which he continued to revisit like visiting old friends. A photograph of his mother, the only family connection he maintained, though he rarely wrote letters and received even fewer. The section house itself bore the marks of his occupancy, small modifications and repairs that had accumulated over 3 years. He'd replaced rotted boards in the floor. He'd patched holes in the roof with tin salvaged from discarded containers. He'd built shelves for his sparse possessions and hooks for his few items of clothing. These improvements weren't just practical, they were psychological, ways of claiming the space as his own, of establishing some small measure of control in an environment that otherwise seemed determined to emphasize human insignificance. Thomas's relationship with his duties had evolved over time. In the beginning, he performed his inspections with anxiety, worried that he might miss some critical detail, some impending failure that would result in disaster. But as months became years, confidence replaced anxiety. He developed an intuitive sense for the tracks, could spot anomalies instantly, knew without measurement whether a rail had shifted enough to require adjustment or a tie had degraded to the point of needing replacement. This expertise made him valuable to the railroad and gave him pride in his work that transcended the modest compensation he received. The Telegraph connected him to the railroad's nervous system, but also emphasized his isolation. He would receive messages about train schedules, maintenance requirements, weather warnings, occasionally personal messages from other watchmen or section foremen along the line. But these exchanges, crackling through the wire in Morse code, seemed ghostly and insubstantial compared to face-to-face conversation. They were communication without connection, information without intimacy, useful but unsatisfying. On his rare trips to Wilcox, Thomas found himself overwhelmed by the sheer presence of other people, the noise and movement and complexity of social interaction. He would complete his business as quickly as possible, purchase supplies, pick up mail, perhaps stop at a saloon for a single drink more from obligation to social ritual than from genuine desire for alcohol. Then he would return to his post with something like relief, the silence of the desert seeming less oppressive than the cacophony of civilization. Desert crossing, the journey begins. Our story proper begins on a particular day in late June of 1910, a day when the temperature would reach 114 degrees by early afternoon, when the sky would be a pitiless blue vault offering no hope of clouds or rain, when the very air seemed to shimmer with heat that rose from the desert floor like visible waves. This was a day that would test both the railroad's infrastructure and the men who maintained it, a day whose events would demonstrate why watchmen like Thomas were essential despite their isolation and the modest regard in which they were held by those who made decisions in distant offices. The morning had begun normally enough. Thomas completed his sunrise inspection without finding anything amiss. The tracks were in good order, rails properly aligned, ties showing no signs of immediate distress. He noted the approach of a freight train around 7 o'clock, the sound of its whistle carrying across the desert air with crystalline clarity. He watched it pass, waving to the engineer who acknowledged him with a short blast of the whistle, the standard greeting between railroad men. The train's passage stirred up dust that took minutes to settle, particles catching the early light and creating momentary rainbows in the disturbed air. 50 miles to the east, a passenger train had departed Wilcox on schedule at 6:30 in the morning. This was train number 7, a regular run that carried passengers from El Paso to Tucson, a journey of just over 300 miles that would take most of the day given the various stops and the locomotives need to take on water at several stations along the route. The consist included a combination baggage and mail car, 2 passenger coaches, and a single Pullman sleeper for those few passengers who could afford the luxury. Among the passengers that morning were a variety of types common to southwestern travel in that era. There were cattlemen traveling to Tucson on business, men whose weathered faces and capable hands marked them as thoroughly at home in the landscape through which they traveled. There were mining company representatives, engineers, and assayers and investors going to inspect properties or negotiate deals. There were a few tourists, Easterners drawn by accounts of the Southwest's dramatic scenery and exotic Native American cultures, carefully maintaining their dignity despite the heat and dust that seemed determined to undermine it. One particular passenger deserves our attention, a woman traveling alone, which was unusual enough in 1910 to draw notice and comment. Her name was Margaret Ashford, and she was 28 years old, making her way from El Paso, where she had been visiting a sister, to Tucson, where she held a position as a teacher at a school for Mission Indians. Margaret was educated, capable, and possessed of the kind of quiet determination that characterized many women who had chosen to make lives in the West despite the region's hostility to feminine conventionality. She sat by a window in the forward passenger coach, a leather-bound book open in her lap, though she paid it little attention, her gaze drawn instead to the landscape sliding past outside. This was her third journey across this particular stretch of desert, and she developed an appreciation for its austere beauty that her Eastern friends would have found incomprehensible. They saw only desolation where she saw subtle gradations of color and form, life adapted to extremity, a kind of honest simplicity that contrasted favorably with the artificial complexity of cities. The morning had been relatively comfortable, the desert's night-stored coolness lingering in the rail cars despite the sun's rising assault. But as the train progressed westward, as the sun climbed higher and the day's heat accumulated, conditions inside the wooden coaches began to deteriorate. The few windows that passengers could open provided little relief, admitting hot air and dust in equal measure. Women fanned themselves with whatever materials came to hand. Men loosened collars and wiped sweat from faces with increasingly sodden handkerchiefs. The conductor and the African-American porter did what they could to keep passengers comfortable. But the reality was that comfort had become a relative concept, achievable only by comparison to actual suffering. Around 9 o'clock, train number 7 made a scheduled stop at a water station called Indian Wells, one of the many such facilities dotted along the line. The locomotive took on water, while passengers were allowed to dismount and stretch their legs, though they were warned to stay close to the train and to return immediately when the whistle sounded. Margaret stepped down onto the platform, such as it was really just a wooden walkway beside the tracks. She observed the water station's operation, the great tank standing on stilts, the leather hose that connected to the locomotive's tender, the practiced efficiency with which the firemen managed the water flow. The station keeper, a Mexican man named Carlos, moved among the passengers offering cups of water from a bucket he'd drawn from the station's well. The water was warm but clean, and passengers accepted it gratefully. Margaret thanked him in Spanish, which caused him to smile and offer additional water, pleased to encounter someone who had bothered to learn his language. They exchanged a few words about the heat and the train schedule before the conductor's whistle warned that departure was imminent. Back aboard the train, Margaret resumed her seat and her observation of the passing landscape. The route took them through terrain that varied more than casual observers might notice. There were long stretches of flat desert floor carpeted with creosote bush and bussage, their dusty green foliage barely stirring in the hot air. There were rocky outcrops where the train's path had been carved through stone, creating cuts that revealed layers of geological history in bands of different colored rock. There were dry washes where flash floods had carved deep channels, spanned by wooden trestles that seemed alarmingly fragile to those unaccustomed to railroad engineering. Around 10:30, approximately 40 miles east of Thomas's section, the locomotive's engineer noticed an unusual vibration in the engine. This was the kind of subtle change that experienced engineers developed an instinctive feel for, a slight irregularity in the rhythm of machinery that could signal anything from a minor annoyance to an impending catastrophe. He mentioned it to his firemen, who listened and agreed that something seemed different, though neither could immediately identify the source. They continued on, the engineer paying close attention to the engine's performance, ready to shut down if the problem worsened. The train climbed a long grade, the locomotive laboring against gravity and heat, steam pressure fluctuating more than usual, requiring constant attention from the firemen who shoveled coal with steady precision. At the top of the grade, they crested and began a descent, and it was here that the problem revealed itself with unfortunate clarity. One of the locomotive's side rod bearings, subjected to months of stress amplified by inadequate lubrication and the expansion of metal in extreme heat, had finally degraded to the point of failure. The bearing began to seize, creating friction that generated immediate and dangerous heat. Within seconds, the engineers smelled hot metal, a distinctive odor that every railroader learns to recognize and fear. He immediately began the emergency shutdown procedure, closing the throttle, applying the brakes, signaling the conductor with the brake cord that something was wrong. The train came to a stop perhaps 2 miles from the grade summit, the locomotive hissing and clicking as it settled, steam escaping from various valves and joints, the smell of overheated metal strong in the air. The engineer and firemen climbed down to assess the damage, and what they found confirmed their fears. The bearing was destroyed, the connecting rod damaged, repairs impossible without parts they didn't have and tools they couldn't access. They were stranded 28 miles east of Thomas's section, 35 miles from Wilcox, with 47 passengers and crew, with daytime temperatures approaching their peak, with water supplies adequate for normal operations, but worryingly insufficient for an extended delay. The conductor, a veteran of 30 years on southwestern railroads, assessed the situation with the kind of calm that comes from having survived previous crises. His first priority was the passengers' welfare. He instructed the porter to work through the cars, explaining the situation, assuring everyone that help was on the way, encouraging water conservation while maintaining morale. His second priority was communication. The train carried no telegraph equipment, but they were equipped with emergency supplies, including a complete set of signal flags and fusees, those emergency flares used to warn approaching trains of trouble. The problem was that the next train scheduled on this line wouldn't arrive until late afternoon, and that was an eastbound freight that wouldn't be able to provide assistance even if it could stop. The rescue would have to come from Wilcox or from one of the maintenance sections along the line, which meant getting word to someone who could dispatch help. The nearest telegraph station was the water station at Indian Wells, 10 miles back the way they'd come. The nearest telephone was at Thomas's section house, 13 miles ahead. The conductor looked at his crew and his passengers, measuring capabilities and risks. Sending someone back to Indian Wells in the building heat would be dangerous. Sending someone forward to the next section house presented similar dangers. But sending no one at all, waiting for evening when another train might pass, and then trying to communicate the problem, seemed equally risky. They had water for perhaps 2 days if carefully rationed, less if people panicked and consumed it carelessly. The heat inside the wooden rail cars was already approaching unbearable levels, and it would only get worse through the afternoon. In the end, the conductor made the decision that many before him had made in similar circumstances. He would send someone forward on foot with a message, requesting immediate assistance, hoping that the section house at mile marker 247 would provide the communication link they needed. The question was whom to send. The obvious choice was someone young and fit, but also someone knowledgeable enough to understand the urgency and competent enough to navigate desert conditions that killed the unwary with reliable efficiency. Among the passengers, a volunteer stepped forward. His name was Daniel Garcia, a young man of 22 whose family had worked on the railroads for 2 generations. He'd grown up in boxcar colonies, knew the desert intimately, spoke both Spanish and English fluently, and most importantly, he understood both the technical aspects of railroad operations and the cultural codes that would allow him to communicate effectively with whoever he encountered. The conductor accepted his offer, grateful but also guilty about sending a passenger into danger that should rightfully be borne by railroad employees. They prepared Daniel as best they could. He was given 2 canteens of water, a quantity that seemed generous, but that experienced desert travelers would have considered barely adequate. He was provided with a hat borrowed from another passenger, its broad brim offering more protection than his own cap. He was given written instructions detailing the train's location and the nature of the emergency, messages that should be telegraphed to Wilcox and to the division headquarters in El Paso. And he was given advice: walk only in whatever shade the morning hours still offered, rest during peak heat, even if it meant stopping where no shelter existed, watch for landmarks, conserve water, but don't hesitate to drink when thirsty. Margaret Ashford watched these preparations with mixed emotions. She admired Daniel's courage, but feared for his safety, understanding, as perhaps some of the male passengers did not, the genuine dangers of desert travel even for relatively short distances. She impulsively added her own contribution to his supplies, a small bottle of glycerin that could be applied to lips and face to help prevent the cracking and splitting that sun and dry air inflicted on exposed skin. Daniel accepted it with a grateful smile and a promise that he would return safely. The crisis unfolds. Daniel Garcia set out just before noon, the absolute worst time for desert travel, but also the time when delay seemed most dangerous. Every hour they waited increased the risk to the passengers crowded in the heating rail cars, increased the depletion of water supplies, increased the likelihood that someone would make a bad decision or that conditions would worsen in some unpredictable way. The conductor watched him go with the heavy feeling that comes from sending another human being into danger, even willingly accepted danger, even necessary danger. The landscape Daniel walked through was typical of this section of the line, rolling hills and flat stretches alternating in patterns determined by ancient geological forces. The tracks ran straight for long distances, then curved to follow the contours of the land, where engineering economics dictated going around obstacles rather than through them. Telegraph poles marked the route, their wires humming faintly in the heat, carrying messages between distant points, but offering no help to the solitary walker below them. For the first hour, Daniel made good progress. He was young and fit, accustomed to physical labor, and the distance he needed to cover, 13 miles, didn't seem insurmountable. But the heat was already intense, the sun beating down with a physical force that seemed to press him into the earth. He could feel moisture evaporating from his skin before sweat could even form properly, the air so dry that normal cooling mechanisms barely functioned. He sipped from his canteen sparingly, knowing that his water had to last not just for the walk, but for the possibility that the section house might be unmanned or that he might have to walk even farther. The desert through which Daniel walked was far from the empty wasteland that distant observers often imagined. Up close, on foot, moving slowly enough to actually see rather than merely pass through, the landscape revealed itself as a complex ecosystem supporting surprising diversity of life. Creosote bushes dominated the flat areas, their branches sparse and twisted, but green despite the heat, their leaves coated with a waxy substance that minimized water loss through evaporation. The creosote's distinctive smell, sharp and resinous, intensified in the heat, creating an odor that newcomers often found unpleasant, but that longtime desert residents came to associate with home. Between the creosote grew other plants equally adapted to extremity. Brittlebush, with its silver-gray leaves that reflected sunlight and reduced heat absorption. Desert marigold that somehow managed to produce bright yellow flowers even in the driest months. A splash of color that seemed defiant of circumstance. Ocotillo with its long, thorny branches that appeared dead most of the year, but that would burst into red-tipped bloom within days of rain. These plants weren't just surviving, they were thriving in their own terms, having evolved strategies that made the desert not a prison but a home. Animal life, though less visible in the midday heat, left abundant evidence of its presence. Lizard tracks crisscrossed the sand, tiny trails where reptiles had scurried from shade to shade in the morning hours before the sun made such activity suicidal. Bird calls echoed from scattered shrubs, species that had learned to time their activities to the desert's rhythms rather than fighting against them. Jackrabbit sign marked places where the long-eared creatures had paused to rest in the shadow of rocks or bushes, their droppings and the prints of their oversized hind feet telling stories to those who knew how to read such texts. As Daniel walked, he found himself cataloging these observations, partly as a distraction from his growing discomfort and partly from genuine interest. He'd grown up near the desert, understood its patterns and dangers, but he'd never before had occasion to traverse it on foot in full daylight during summer. The experience was illuminating in ways both literal and metaphorical, teaching lessons about vulnerability and endurance that he suspected would stay with him long after this particular emergency was resolved. The heat affected his body in ways that were initially subtle, but that accumulated toward significance. His mouth grew dry despite regular sips of water, saliva becoming thick and sticky. His eyes began to burn, the combination of glare and dust creating irritation that made blinking uncomfortable. His skin, though covered by his borrowed hat and his own long sleeves, felt tight and hot, radiating warmth back into the air like a stove that had absorbed hours of sun. His breathing grew slightly labored, not from exertion exactly, but from the effort required to extract oxygen from air that seemed too thin and hot to properly serve its purpose. The psychological effects were equally notable. The landscape's vastness, its apparent emptiness, created a sense of exposure that city dwellers rarely experienced. There was nowhere to hide from the sun, no shelter to retreat to, no alternative but to keep moving forward toward a destination that remained invisible beyond intervening rises and curves. The knowledge that he was alone, that if something went wrong there would be no immediate help, no quick rescue, added a layer of anxiety to his physical discomfort. He understood viscerally what frontier travelers had always known, that the desert's beauty was inseparable from its danger, that the same qualities that made it spectacular also made it deadly. By the end of the second hour, Daniel's pace had slowed noticeably. The initial optimism that had carried him through the first miles had been replaced by grim determination. His canteens, which had started full, were now noticeably lighter. He'd been drinking more frequently than he'd intended, thirst overriding his rational plans for conservation. He calculated that, at his current rate of consumption, he'd run out of water before reaching the section house, leaving him dependent on Thomas's hospitality and the hope that Thomas would actually be present and able to provide assistance. The tracks themselves became both guide and torment. They stretched ahead and behind with geometric precision, parallel lines that never converged despite perspective suggestions, markers of civilization and progress that somehow emphasized rather than mitigated the landscape's harshness. The railroad bed, raised slightly above the surrounding terrain and surfaced with gravel and cinders, was easier to walk on than the desert floor would have been, but the dark ballast absorbed and radiated heat in ways that created a microclimate even more oppressive than the general conditions. Daniel found himself walking beside the tracks rather than on them, trading the slightly better footing for marginally cooler temperatures. Back at the stranded train, the conductor's management of the crisis continued with practiced calm that masked genuine concern. The jerry-rigged shade cloths helped, but they couldn't eliminate the fundamental problem that wooden rail cars in summer desert were essentially ovens. The interior temperature had reached what he estimated was at least 100 degrees, possibly higher, creating conditions that were bearable for short periods, but that became increasingly dangerous as hours accumulated. He walked through the cars regularly, checking on passengers, assessing their conditions, looking for signs of heat-related illness that might require immediate intervention. Most people were coping, uncomfortable, but not yet in actual distress. They fanned themselves with whatever materials came to hand, newspapers and magazines, and improvised fans constructed from folded paper. They sat as still as possible, having learned that movement generated additional heat that their bodies struggled to dissipate. They spoke little, conversation seeming like an unnecessary expenditure of energy better conserved for simply enduring. But the conductors practiced, I noted concerning signs in several passengers. An elderly gentleman in the forward coach had stopped sweating, his face flushed an unhealthy red, his breathing rapid and shallow. These were symptoms of heat exhaustion potentially progressing toward heat stroke, the condition where the body's cooling systems failed entirely and core temperature began to rise toward levels that could damage organs and brain. The conductor had the porter move the man to the shadiest spot in the car, applied cool compresses from their limited water supply, encouraged him to drink in small sips, and watched him closely for any further deterioration. A young mother traveling with two small children was showing signs of panic that threatened to become contagious. Her children, overwhelmed by the heat and the disruption of routine, were crying despite her efforts to comfort them. Other passengers were beginning to show irritation at the noise, which was understandable, but which created additional tension that the conductor recognized as potentially dangerous. He intervened diplomatically, asking Margaret Ashford to take particular charge of this family, to help distract the children and support the mother, giving both specific tasks that channeled their anxieties into productive activity. Margaret rose to the challenge with the kind of competence that comes from experience dealing with children under trying circumstances. She gathered not just this family, but all the children in the car into a small group, positioned in the coolest available space. She produced from her bag a collection of items that suddenly became toys, a piece of string that could be used for Cat's cradle, some folded paper that could be transformed into simple origami figures, a small book of poems that she read aloud in a calm, soothing voice that helped stabilize the emotional climate of the entire car. The mining engineers, having exhausted the possibilities of their mechanical ventilation system, turned their problem-solving skills toward water conservation and distribution. They calculated current consumption rates, estimated time until rescue based on the conductor's best information, determined how much water could be allocated per person while maintaining a safety margin for unexpected delays. Their numbers were not particularly encouraging. The math suggested they had perhaps 30 hours before water shortage became critical, but having quantified the problem somehow made it feel more manageable, transformed vague anxiety into specific challenge that could be addressed through planning and discipline. The cattlemen, whose stoicism had been noted earlier, now demonstrated another quality characteristic of their profession: practical resourcefulness. One of them, a leathery individual named Hutchins who'd spent 40 years working ranches across the Southwest, began explaining to interested passengers the signs and symptoms of heat-related illness and the field treatment for each. He'd lost men to heat stroke over the years, understood exactly how quickly conditions could deteriorate, and believed that educated passengers would be better able to help themselves and others if the situation continued to deteriorate. His impromptu lesson covered the progression of heat illness with clarity born of painful experience. Heat cramps came first, he explained, caused by loss of salt through sweating. The symptoms were muscle spasms, usually in the legs or abdomen, painful but not immediately dangerous. Treatment was simple: move to shade, rest, drink water, and ideally consume some salt if available. Heat exhaustion followed if conditions persisted, characterized by heavy sweating, pale and clammy skin, weakness, headache, nausea. Treatment was more urgent but still straightforward. Move to coolest available location. Lie down with feet elevated, loosen clothing, drink water in small amounts, apply cool compresses if possible. Heat stroke, Hutchins explained with particular gravity, was the crisis that could kill. The symptoms were dramatic and unmistakable. Sweating stopped entirely as the body's cooling system failed. Skin became hot and dry. Body temperature spiked above 104 degrees. Confusion and loss of consciousness could follow rapidly. Treatment required aggressive cooling. Move victim to shade immediately. Remove unnecessary clothing. Apply cool water to skin, especially at neck, armpits, and groin where major blood vessels ran close to surface. Fan vigorously to increase evaporation. Get medical help as quickly as possible. But out here, Hutchins added soberly, medical help might not be available quickly enough, which was why prevention was so critical: staying in shade, drinking adequate water, recognizing early symptoms before they progressed to crisis. As afternoon wore on toward its hottest point, typically between 2 and 3 o'clock in this region and season, the temperature inside the rail cars continued to climb. The conductor's thermometer, hung in the shadiest available spot, registered 114 degrees. Outside, in direct sunlight, temperatures likely exceeded 120 degrees, levels that could cause disabling burns on exposed skin within minutes. The metal parts of the railroad cars became too hot to touch, painful even to approach closely, radiating heat that added to the ambient misery. Daniel, still walking, still making progress, had entered what experienced desert travelers recognize as a dangerous mental state. The heat and exertion and dehydration combined to create a kind of narrowed consciousness where immediate sensation dominated and larger awareness dimmed. He was focused intensely on each step, on maintaining his forward momentum, on the sip of increasingly warm water he allowed himself every few minutes. But he'd lost track of time, couldn't quite remember how long he'd been walking or how far he'd come. The landscape had become surreal, shimmering and distorted, solid objects seeming to float and waver in ways that his rational mind knew were optical illusions, but that his senses insisted were real. Hallucinations, mild but definite, began to intrude. He thought he saw water in the distance, a lake or pool that reflected the sky, classic mirage that disappeared as he approached. He heard sounds that weren't there, voices calling, machinery running, the whistle of trains that didn't exist. He felt presences nearby, other travelers, or perhaps spirits, beings just at the edge of vision that vanished when he tried to look directly at them. These weren't full psychotic breaks from reality, just the mind's attempts to process sensory information that was increasingly unreliable as his physical systems struggled under the mounting stress. His body had entered survival mode, prioritizing core functions over comfort or optimal performance. Blood flow to his extremities decreased, redirected toward vital organs. His heart rate accelerated to compensate for reduced blood volume as dehydration progressed. His body temperature began to rise despite the evaporative cooling of what little sweat his dehydrated system could still produce. He wasn't yet in immediate danger, his youth and fitness providing buffers that older or less healthy individuals wouldn't have had, but he was approaching the boundaries where those buffers would no longer be sufficient. And then, emerging from the heat shimmer and distortion, he saw something that might have been another hallucination, but that he desperately hoped was real. A building, small and weathered, sitting beside the tracks perhaps half a mile ahead. The section house at mile marker 247, his destination, his salvation if he could only reach it. He stopped walking, stood swaying slightly, tried to confirm that what he was seeing was actually there and not just another cruel trick of overheated perception. The building remained visible, solid, undoubtedly real. Renewed energy flooded through him. Not physical energy exactly, but determination fueled by proximity to relief, and he resumed walking, faster now, driven by the knowledge that help and water and shade were within reach if he could just maintain consciousness and mobility for a few more minutes. Back at the stranded train, the conductor implemented emergency procedures designed for exactly this kind of situation. The porter and brakeman rigged shade cloths outside the passenger cars, using materials from the baggage car to create awnings that blocked direct sunlight from the windows. This helped marginally, reducing interior temperatures perhaps 5 or 10 degrees, which in the scheme of things was the difference between miserable and potentially dangerous. Water was distributed in carefully measured portions, enough to stave off serious dehydration, but not enough to eliminate thirst. The conductor emphasized repeatedly that water was available, that no one should hesitate to ask if they truly needed it, but that conservation would allow them to maintain this situation for longer. Margaret made herself useful by helping to organize the children into activities that would keep them calm and distracted. There were 4 children on the train, ranging in age from 5 to 12, and they were simultaneously more resilient and more vulnerable than the adults. She told them stories, led them in singing, turned the emergency into something that seemed like an adventure rather than a crisis. The parents were grateful, relieved to have their children's minds occupied by something other than the heat and the worry. The mining engineers, accustomed to problem solving in difficult conditions, set up a system for circulating air through the cars using makeshift fans constructed from luggage and determination. It wasn't sophisticated, but it provided some sense of control, gave people something to focus on besides their discomfort. The cattlemen, used to adversity, maintained a stoic silence that was somehow more reassuring than cheerful platitudes would have been. They sat with the patience of men who knew that complaining changed nothing, and that endurance was simply what you did when circumstances left no alternatives. Meanwhile, Thomas had completed his morning inspection and returned to his section house, oblivious to the drama unfolding 28 miles away. He went about his usual midday routine, seeking shade, sipping water, reading from a book he'd read dozens of times before. The telegraph was silent, no messages coming through, which was normal enough. The railroad didn't communicate when everything was working. Communication happened when there were problems, changes to schedules, warnings about weather or track conditions. Silence meant normalcy, operations proceeding as designed, the great machine functioning without requiring human intervention beyond the routine maintenance that kept it running. Around 1 o'clock, Thomas emerged from his section house to check the cistern level, a daily ritual that kept him aware of his water status. As he stood in the minimal shade offered by the tank's stilts, he noticed something unusual in the eastern distance. Heat waves rose from the desert floor, creating the familiar shimmer that made distant objects seem to float and waver. But within this distortion, Thomas's experienced, I detected something that didn't belong, a vertical movement that suggested a person walking along the tracks. It took several minutes of observation before Thomas could be certain. Yes, someone was definitely approaching on foot, still perhaps 2 miles distant, but closing slowly. This was unusual enough to be concerning. People didn't walk railroad tracks in the heat of the day without good reason. The possibilities that ran through Thomas's mind were all variations on trouble. An accident, an injury, a derailment, a train breakdown, someone lost and desperate. He watched and waited, and as the figure drew closer, he could see that it was a young man, moving with determination, but also with the careful placing of steps that suggested fatigue. Thomas prepared for a visitor, filling a tin cup with water from his personal supply, moving in a shade where conversation would be possible without the sun as a third participant. When Daniel finally reached the section house, stumbling slightly on the rough ground away from the tracks, Thomas was ready. He handed over the water without speaking, let the young man drink, refilled the cup, and let him drink again before asking any questions. Daniel's story emerged in fragments, interrupted by his need to catch his breath and reorient himself after the ordeal of the walk. Train number 7, broken down, 28 miles back, 47 people, water situation manageable but declining, urgent need for rescue locomotive and repair crew. Thomas listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that every detail might be important, asked clarifying questions about the exact nature of the mechanical failure, about the condition of the passengers, about whether the conductor had taken appropriate safety measures. Then Thomas moved into action with practiced efficiency. He led Daniel into the section house, into the relative coolness of the interior, sat him down, and brought out food, simple fare, but sufficient. While Daniel ate, Thomas went to the telegraph equipment and began composing messages. The primary message went to the dispatcher in Wilcox, explaining the situation, requesting immediate dispatch of a relief locomotive and repair crew to the coordinates he calculated based on Daniel's description of the breakdown location. A secondary message went to the division superintendent in El Paso, a courtesy notification that wouldn't result in immediate action, but that kept upper management informed as protocol required. The responses came quickly, the crackling of Morse code confirming that help was being organized. A locomotive would be dispatched from Wilcox within the hour, should reach the stranded train by mid-afternoon, would tow it back to Wilcox where repairs could be undertaken properly. A maintenance crew was being assembled to go with the locomotive, would assess whether on-site repairs were feasible or whether the damaged engine would need to be replaced entirely. Passengers would be transferred to other accommodations if the delays extended beyond evening. Thomas acknowledged these messages, confirmed his own status as operational and ready to assist if needed. Then he turned his attention back to Daniel, who had recovered somewhat from his ordeal, but who was clearly in no condition to walk back immediately. Thomas made a decision that fell outside strict railroad protocol, but that seemed obviously correct. Daniel would rest at the section house until the relief train passed, would then flag it down and ride back to rejoin the stranded passengers. This would allow him to recover fully and would ensure that Thomas, who might be needed to coordinate additional assistance, remained at his post. As the afternoon progressed, Thomas and Daniel settled into an unexpected companionship. They talked, as men do when thrust together by circumstances, sharing backgrounds and experiences despite their different ages and trajectories. Daniel spoke of his family's 3 generations of railroad work, his father's pride in the labor that had built the Southwest transportation infrastructure, his own ambitions to move beyond track labor into positions of greater responsibility and better compensation. Thomas shared, cautiously at first, and then with increasing openness, his own history of drift and eventual anchorage at this isolated post. They discussed the railroad's future, the changes they'd seen and the changes they anticipated. Daniel was optimistic, believing that opportunities for Mexican-American workers would expand as the industry grew and as recognition of their essential contributions spread. Thomas was more skeptical, having seen how prejudice and economic calculation combined to keep certain groups in subordinate positions regardless of merit. But both agreed that the railroad itself was transformative, that it was turning the Southwest from frontier to settled region, that the changes it brought were permanent and profound. Around 3 o'clock, Thomas received telegraph notification that the relief train had departed Wilcox and was making good time. It should pass his section in approximately 90 minutes, would slow but not stop unless flagged, would reach the stranded train within 3 hours. Thomas calculated water requirements, estimated that the original train supply should be adequate until rescue arrived, assumed that the conductor was managing the situation competently, which was a reasonable assumption given his reputation. Daniel used the time to write a letter to his mother, borrowing paper and pen from Thomas, composing words that tried to make his desert walk seem more adventurous than dangerous. He knew she would worry regardless, but he also knew that minimizing the real risks was a kindness that spared her unnecessary distress. He described the landscape he'd walked through, the section house where he'd found shelter, the watchman who had provided help. He sealed the letter and addressed it intending to post it from Wilcox whenever they finally arrived there. The night vigil. The relief train passed Thomas's section on schedule, and Daniel flagged it down as arranged. Thomas watched him board, waved as the train pulled away eastward toward the breakdown site. Then the section house fell silent again, returning to its normal state of isolation. Thomas went about his evening routine, but something had changed. The mechanical emergency had disrupted the usual patterns, introduced human drama into what was normally an environment of simple cause and effect. Thomas completed his evening track inspection, walking westward through the cooling air as the sun approached the horizon. The mountains turned purple and orange, the play of light on rock creating effects of almost painful beauty. He found himself thinking about the passengers on the stranded train, Margaret Ashford and the children she'd been entertaining, the stoic cattlemen and worried mining engineers, all those people whose lives had intersected briefly with his isolated existence through the medium of a mechanical failure and a young man's courageous walk. The desert's transformation from day to night was always spectacular, but tonight Thomas paid particular attention to the process, seeing it almost as if for the first time despite having witnessed it hundreds of times before. The quality of light changed minute by minute, the harsh white glare of afternoon giving way to golden warmth, then to amber and rose, finally to the deep purple blue of twilight. Shadows lengthened dramatically, transforming familiar terrain into alien landscapes, where every rock and bush took on exaggerated significance. The air itself seemed to change texture, the oppressive thickness of midday heat thinning to something more breathable, almost pleasant in contrast to what had come before. As the sun dropped below the western horizon, the sky became a canvas for color that no painter could adequately capture. Layers of atmosphere, filled with dust and moisture suspended at different altitudes, created bands of purple, orange, pink, and gold that shifted and merged as light conditions continued to evolve. Venus appeared first, the evening star bright enough to cast faint shadows once full darkness arrived. Then other planets and stars emerged, first the brightest, then gradually fainter ones as eyes adapted to the diminishing light and the sky's background glow faded toward black. Thomas had learned the constellations during his years at the section house, taught himself their names and stories from an old astronomy book he'd acquired in Wilcox. Tonight he traced their familiar patterns, Scorpius with its distinctive curved tail dominating the southern sky, Sagittarius the archer aiming his arrow toward the galactic center where stars clustered so thickly they appeared as luminous clouds rather than individual points. The summer triangle was visible overhead, Vega, Altair, and Deneb forming corners of a geometric figure that seemed impossibly large, yet perfectly proportioned. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. Individual stars too numerous and faint to count, but collectively creating a band of luminescence that ancient peoples had imagined as divine pathways or cosmic roads. The temperature dropped rapidly once the sun's direct heating ceased. Within an hour of sunset, the air had cooled 20 degrees. Within 2 hours, it would drop another 10 or 15. By the hour before dawn, the temperature would reach its minimum, perhaps 70 degrees or even cooler, a shocking contrast to the afternoon's murderous heat. This dramatic daily swing was characteristic of desert environments where low humidity and minimal vegetation meant that heat absorbed during the day radiated back into space at night with little to slow its escape. Thomas had been about to go inside when he received the telegraph confirmation that the relief had been successful. The message was terse, as railroad communications tended to be, but it conveyed the essential information. Train number 7 now in tow. All passengers safe. Estimated arrival Wilcox, 2100 hours. Breakdown locomotive being shipped to El Paso shops. Route maintenance schedule unaffected. The dispatcher added a brief personal note, acknowledging Thomas's assistance and Daniel Garcia's courage. These few extra words, unnecessary from a strictly operational standpoint, represented a level of human recognition that Thomas found unexpectedly moving. He sat on the wooden chair he'd positioned outside the section house's door, a perch from which he could observe both the tracks and the wider landscape. The evening sounds of the desert created a soundscape entirely different from daytime's comparative silence. Coyotes began their nightly communications, their howls carrying for miles across the open spaces, individual animals announcing their locations and perhaps coordinating their hunting strategies. Nighthawks emerged to hunt insects, their calls distinctive booming sounds produced by air rushing through their wings as they dove. Bats emerged from whatever crevices they'd occupied during daylight, their echolocation clicks audible at the very edge of human hearing, creating a sense of presence even when the animals themselves remained invisible in the darkness. Small mammals became active, cautiously emerging from burrows and hiding places to forage under cover of darkness when predators had more difficulty seeing them. Thomas could hear rustling in the brush, movements too small to be dangerous but too purposeful to be just wind. Kangaroo rats, perhaps, those remarkable creatures that could survive their entire lives without drinking water, extracting all needed moisture from seeds and vegetation. Or maybe would rats, building their elaborate stick nests in mesquite thickets. Or pocket mice, tiny creatures whose survival in the desert seemed almost miraculous given their size and vulnerability. Insects provided a constant background hum, though much diminished from the aggressive daytime swarms. Desert crickets chirped in rhythms that varied with temperature, their calls actually functioning as reasonably accurate thermometers for those who knew the formula. Moths fluttered past, drawn toward whatever minimal light leaked from Thomas's section house. Beetles crawled through the sand, leaving tracks that would tell stories to mourning observers. The insect life of the desert was far more diverse and abundant than casual observers realized, countless species having evolved to exploit every available niche in an ecosystem that seemed to offer so little. Thomas found himself reflecting on the day's events with unusual depth. His normal mode of thought was practical and immediate, focused on tasks to be completed and problems to be solved. But tonight, perhaps because the emergency had broken his routine, perhaps because Daniel's visit had provided an opportunity for extended conversation with another human being, he found himself thinking about larger patterns and meanings. What did it signify that he had chosen this isolated life? What had he been seeking when he accepted this posting? And what had he actually found? The easy answer was that he needed steady employment, and this job had been available. But Thomas recognized that as incomplete, a surface explanation that didn't account for why he'd stayed 3 years when most watchmen lasted less than one. The truth, insofar as he could articulate it, had something to do with the desert's honesty. Life here was stripped of pretense and complication. You either did what was necessary to survive, or you didn't survive. The environment provided immediate feedback about your choices and your capabilities. There are no politics to navigate, No social hierarchies to manage, no complex interpersonal dynamics to decode. Just you and the landscape and the work, with success or failure determined by observable, measurable factors. But there is also loneliness, a quality of isolation that went beyond simply being alone. Thomas had grown accustomed to solitude, even comfortable with it in many ways. But he recognized that comfort with solitude wasn't the same as genuine contentment. Human beings were social creatures, evolved to live in groups, to communicate and cooperate and create cultures. Extended isolation went against that nature, created psychological stresses that were real even if they weren't always obvious. Thomas noticed these stresses in himself. The way his voice had become rough from disuse, the way his thoughts sometimes seemed to circle back on themselves without resolution, the way he developed elaborate internal dialogues with imaginary companions who expressed opinions he didn't personally hold, but who provided a kind of debate that he missed from not having actual conversation partners. The stars continued their slow wheel overhead, the Earth's rotation creating the illusion that the celestial sphere was moving while he remained stationary. Of course, Thomas understood the reality, that he was spinning through space at hundreds of miles per hour, that the Earth was orbiting the Sun at thousands of miles per hour, that the Sun itself was moving through the galaxy at speeds that defied easy comprehension. This knowledge, which would have seemed bizarre and threatening to people only a few generations earlier, had become commonplace through the spread of scientific education. Yet knowing the mechanics didn't diminish the emotional and aesthetic impact of watching the stars, didn't make the experience less meaningful or moving. Around midnight, Thomas heard the whistle of an approaching train, the eastbound freight carrying copper or that passed his section nightly. He rose from his chair and walked toward the tracks, positioning himself where the engineer would see him. This wasn't necessary. The train wasn't scheduled to stop, and there were no problems to report. But it had become a kind of ritual, a moment of connection, however brief, with another human being, an acknowledgement of shared existence in the desert night. The locomotive appeared first as a light in the distance, its headlamp cutting through darkness, illuminating the tracks ahead, and revealing obstacles that might threaten safe passage. As it drew closer, Thomas could see the details of the engine, the glow from the firebox when the fireman opened it to add coal, the movement of running gear and drivers, the steam leaking from various joints and valves. The whistles sounded again, 3 sharp blasts that were the standard greeting between railroad men. Thomas raised his arm in acknowledgement, a gesture the engineer returned as the locomotive thundered past. The cars followed, dozens of them coupled together, each loaded with tons of copper that would be transformed in distant smelters into wire and pipe and equipment. The cars were open-topped, their contents visible in the starlight and the glow from the engine. The weight of the train was evident in how it seemed to press the tracks deeper into the roadbed, in the grinding roar of wheel flanges against rails, in the way the ground shook with each passing car. This was power made manifest, the industrial age's triumph over distance and difficulty, thousands of tons of material moving through the night at speeds that would have seemed magical to previous generations. The caboose brought up the rear, its windows lit, a brakeman visible inside attending to paperwork or simply watching the night pass. The brakeman waved, Thomas waved back, and then the train was gone, its taillights diminishing toward the east, the sound of its passage fading gradually until once again only the desert's natural sound remained. Thomas stood by the tracks for several minutes more, feeling the warmth they'd retained from the train's passage gradually dissipate into the cool night air. He thought about the ore in those cars, dug from deep mines by men working in darkness and danger, transported by rail to smelters where it would be refined at temperatures hot enough to melt metal, then shaped into products that would eventually reach users thousands of miles away. The complexity of the supply chain, the number of people whose labor contributed to the final product, was staggering when you actually stopped to consider it. And his own role, seemingly insignificant in the larger scheme, was actually essential. Without watchmen like him maintaining the tracks, inspecting for problems, reporting issues before they became catastrophic, the whole system would fail. The train he just watched pass safely would have been at risk of derailment, destruction, death. The insignificant was actually indispensable. These thoughts carried Thomas back to his section house. He lit a lamp inside, keeping the flame low to conserve kerosene and to maintain his night vision. He poured water from his personal supply, drank slowly, appreciating its coolness and clarity. He ate a simple meal, beans and hardtack, food that required minimal preparation but that provided necessary calories and nutrition. Then he sat at a small desk and updated his logbook, recording the day's events with the precision and detail that railroad procedures required. The logbook entry for this day would be longer and more eventful than most. He noted the arrival of Daniel Garcia at 12:45, the nature of the emergency he reported, the telegraph messages sent and received, the departure of the relief train, the confirmation of successful rescue. He added observations about track conditions, weather, temperature extremes, anything that might be relevant for future reference or that might help other railroad employees understand this section's particular characteristics and challenges. The act of writing, of translating experience into words and organizing those words into coherent narrative, had a calming effect, creating order from what had been a chaotic and unpredictable day. When the logbook was complete and properly filed, Thomas allowed himself a period of reading, his nightly ritual before attempting sleep. Tonight, he chose poetry rather than the adventure novels he usually favored. The poems, drawn from a collection he'd owned for years, spoke of nature and solitude, companionship and loss, all themes that resonated with his current state of mind. He read slowly, savoring the language, allowing the rhythm and imagery to work their subtle magic on his consciousness. Poetry had seemed frivolous when he first acquired this book, an unnecessary indulgence in circumstances that demanded practicality. But he'd gradually come to appreciate its value, the way it captured and articulated emotions and experiences that were difficult to express in ordinary prose. By 1 a.m, Thomas felt sleep beginning to approach. He extinguished the lamp, using the practiced motion that avoided producing excess smoke that would leave smudges on the glass chimney. Darkness returned to the section house's interior, though not complete darkness. Starlight filtering through windows provided enough illumination to navigate familiar space. He removed his boots, loosened his collar, lay down on the cot that served as his bed. The mattress was thin, the springs occasionally protested under his weight, but he'd long since grown accustomed to its particular discomforts and barely noticed them anymore. Sleep came gradually, consciousness fading through layers of drowsiness toward unconsciousness. In the intermediate state, Thomas's thoughts became less controlled, more associative. Images from the day mixed with memories from years past, with hopes and fears that normally stayed buried beneath the practical concerns of daily survival. He saw Daniel walking through the desert heat, saw the faces of passengers in their overheated rail cars, saw the mountains turning purple in twilight, saw stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. He heard telegraph clicks and train whistles, coyote calls and cricket chirps, all blending into a soundscape that was simultaneously specific to this place and time and somehow universal, connecting him to all the human beings who had ever lain awake at night, listening to the sounds of their surroundings and wondering about their place in the larger story. And then sleep claimed him fully, carrying him away from conscious thought into dreams that would be forgotten by morning, but that served their essential function of processing the day's experiences and preparing his mind for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. Outside, the desert continued its nightly routines, indifferent to human presence, following patterns established long before humans existed and which would continue long after they were gone. The section house stood solid in the darkness, a small human mark on an immense landscape, shelter and purpose combined in a structure that represented both ambition and humility, civilization's reach into wildness and wildness's persistent presence despite all efforts to domesticate it. As night fell, Thomas received confirmation that the relief had been successful. The stranded train was being towed back to Wilcox, all passengers safe, water supplies still adequate, no injuries beyond minor cases of heat exhaustion. The breakdown locomotive would be assessed in Wilcox's shops, either repaired or replaced, depending on the extent of damage. Train number 7's route would be covered by a substitute engine the following day. Everything was being handled according to established procedures. Thomas sat outside his section house, enjoying the night's coolness, looking up at stars that seemed close enough to touch. He thought about the interconnectedness that the railroad represented, the way it linked isolated points across vast distances, the way it made each person's actions matter to people they would never meet. His morning inspection, performed as always, had ensured that the track was safe for trains that came through later. His response to Daniel's arrival had helped resolve a situation that could have become much more serious. His maintenance of the telegraph equipment had allowed rapid communication that organized the rescue. These thoughts weren't prideful exactly, but they carried a satisfaction that Thomas rarely allowed himself to feel. His work mattered. His isolation had purpose. The 3 years he'd spent at this post, enduring heat and cold and loneliness, had been in service of something larger than himself, something that justified the personal sacrifices he'd made. The desert night was alive with sounds that daytime's heat suppressed. Coyotes called to each other across the distances, their howls carrying for miles an air that had lost the day's thickness. Nighthawks swooped after insects, their calls strange and mechanical. Small mammals rustled through brush, hunting or being hunted, playing out dramas as ancient as life itself. Thomas listened to all of it with the attention of someone who had learned that entertainment in isolation came from noticing what was there rather than wishing for what wasn't. Around midnight, another train passed, an eastbound freight carrying copper ore from Arizona mines to smelters in El Paso. Its passage was routine, the engineer acknowledging Thomas with a whistle blast. The long train of or cars rumbling past and disappearing into darkness toward the mountains. Thomas watched its taillights diminish and vanish, felt the familiar vibration in the ground fade to stillness, returned to his contemplation of the stars. He thought about Daniel, probably arriving in Wilcox around now, reuniting with the passengers who had waited through the afternoon's heat for rescue that finally came. He thought about Margaret Ashford, wondered what she'd thought of her adventure, whether she'd been frightened or whether she'd maintained the kind of calm competence that some people seem to possess naturally. He thought about the conductor, veteran of 3 decades of railroad crises, probably filing reports now that would document every detail of the breakdown and rescue for review by officials who would never fully appreciate what had actually happened. The temperature continued to drop, and Thomas eventually retreated inside, closing the door against the night air that would be cold by dawn. He lit a lamp, maintaining its flame at the minimum level that allowed reading, conserving kerosene as he conserved everything else. He read for an hour, losing himself in stories of places he would probably never visit, lives he would probably never lead. Then he extinguished the lamp, lay down on his cot, and drifted towards sleep while the desert night wheeled overhead in its ancient patterns. Resolution and legacy. The following day brought a return to normal operations. Train number 7's route was covered by a substitute locomotive pulling the same passenger cars, now carrying a somewhat smaller passenger load, including Margaret Ashford, who continued westward toward Tucson and her teaching position. Daniel Garcia had remained in Wilcox, visiting family there before continuing his own journey. The breakdown locomotive was indeed beyond field repair and was shipped to larger shops in El Paso for complete bearing replacement and general overhaul. Thomas received a telegraph message from the division superintendent acknowledging his assistance in resolving the emergency. The message was brief and formulaic, but represented official recognition of his contribution, something that would be entered in his personnel file and might, eventually, result in some small improvement in his circumstances. More meaningful to Thomas was a message from Daniel, sent via the Wilcox Telegraph office, thanking him for the assistance and the hospitality, expressing hope that they might meet again under better circumstances. Life at mile marker 247 returned to its usual rhythms. Thomas performed his inspections, maintained his equipment, endured the heat, and cherished the brief periods of coolness, watched trains pass and seasons change. But something had shifted subtly but permanently. The emergency had reminded him that his isolation wasn't abandonment, that he was connected to a larger community even if he rarely saw its members face to face. The railroad linked not just places but people, not just goods but lives. Years would pass before the era of the desert watchman came to an end, rendered obsolete by technological improvements and economic calculations that favored different approaches to track maintenance and safety. Telephone and later radio communication would reduce the need for telegraph stations at section houses. Improved locomotives would require fewer water stops, eliminating many of the small stations where watchmen had been stationed. Mechanized track inspection equipment would replace the morning and evening walks that men like Thomas had performed for decades. The romantic notion of solitary guardians protecting the rails would give way to the efficient reality of mobile crews and centralized monitoring. But in 1910, in that particular summer when a bearing failed and a young man walked 13 miles through heat that could kill, the system worked exactly as it was supposed to. A watchman was at his post, equipment was maintained and operational, communication was rapid and effective, help was organized and dispatched, passengers were rescued without serious incident. The railroad's nervous system, composed of men and wires and discipline, functioned precisely as designed. Thomas himself would remain at his post for 7 more years, finally leaving in 1917 when the American entry into World War I created labor shortages that drew workers away from isolated positions toward better-paying jobs in cities and factories. He drifted again, trying various occupations, never quite finding another place that felt as much like home as that section house in the desert had felt. He died in 1945, an unremarkable death in a veterans hospital, leaving behind no family, few possessions, and a personnel file that documented 17 years of railroad service performed competently, but without distinction in the eyes of those who kept such records. The section house at mile marker 247 survived longer than Thomas's memory. It continued to serve as a maintenance station through the 1920s and into the 1930s, though with decreasing importance as technology and economics shifted. By 1940, it stood vacant, windows broken, roof beginning to fail, doors hanging open to admit wind and animals. In 1955, the railroad company ordered its demolition, judging that maintaining even unoccupied structures on abandoned sections of right-of-way represented an unnecessary liability. A crew with sledgehammers and a truck reduced the building to salvageable lumber and debris in an afternoon's work. Today, only a careful observer would notice the site where the section house once stood. A slight rise in the ground, a rectangular depression where the foundation was dug, a few pieces of rusted metal half buried in soil accumulated over decades. The tracks are still there, still carrying trains, though with much less frequency than in 1910. Modern locomotives pull longer trains staffed by smaller crews. Communications happen via satellite. Track maintenance is performed by machines that can do in hours what took weeks when done by hand. Broader historical context. The story of Thomas and the railroad watchman he represented is part of a larger narrative about the transformation of the American Southwest during the early 20th century. The railroads that employed men like Thomas were instruments of dramatic change, connecting isolated regions to national and international economies, facilitating migrations that remade the region's demographic composition, enabling industrial development that would have been impossible without efficient transportation. The workers who built and maintained these railroads came from diverse backgrounds and faced varied challenges based on their ethnicity, nationality, and race. Mexican workers, particularly after 1900, became the primary labor force for track maintenance throughout the Southwest. These traqueros, as they were known, lived in mobile communities housed in converted boxcars that moved along the rail lines as work required. They faced discrimination in wages and working conditions, typically earning significantly less than white workers performing identical tasks. The history of Mexican railroad labor in the United States is deeply intertwined with the political upheaval south of the border. The Mexican Revolution of 1910, which began in the same year as our story takes place, sent waves of refugees northward seeking safety and economic opportunity. Many found employment on the railroads, which were chronically short of labor and willing to hire workers regardless of their legal status or documentation. This created communities throughout the Southwest, from El Paso to Chicago, from Los Angeles to Kansas City, that trace their origins to railroad work camps. Native American railroad workers, particularly from tribes like the Navajo, Pueblo peoples, and various Apache groups, also played crucial roles in railroad construction and maintenance. The Laguna Pueblo people, for example, established entire colonies along rail lines, setting up their traditional social structures in the alien environment of railroad camps. They arranged their boxcar housing to create central plazas where ceremonies and community gatherings could take place, maintaining cultural continuity even as they participated in the industrial transformation of their homeland. The Navajo, whose reservation lands were crossed by railroad lines, became especially important to track maintenance operations. By the early 20th century, hundreds of Navajo men worked as trackmen, their traditional understanding of desert survival making them particularly valuable in the harsh conditions of the Southwest. Their employment patterns followed seasonal rhythms, with men traveling from the reservation to railroad work sites, earning wages that supplemented their families' traditional pastoral and agricultural economies. These diverse labor forces worked under conditions that modern observers would find shocking. 12-hour workdays were standard. Exposure to extreme temperatures was unavoidable. Access to clean water was often limited. Medical care was minimal or non-existent. Injuries were common, deaths not infrequent. The railroad companies maintained that these were simply the realities of frontier industry, unavoidable costs of developing a harsh landscape. Workers and later labor organizers argued, with considerable justification, that the companies prioritized profits over safety and human welfare. Women's roles in railroad communities, while less visible than men's, were nonetheless crucial. Wives of section foremen, track workers, and station agents created homes in environments that seemed designed to prevent domesticity. They raised children in isolation, taught them lessons from whatever textbooks they could acquire, provided medical care based on folk knowledge and determination, since doctors were rarely accessible. They maintained gardens that often failed, cooked meals from limited ingredients in primitive kitchens, washed clothes in water that had to be carried from wells or cisterns. Some women found employment with the railroad companies directly, though opportunities were limited. The Fred Harvey Company, which operated restaurants and hotels along the Santa Fe Railway, became famous for employing young white women as waitresses, the so-called Harvey girls, who served meals to passengers at stops along the route. These positions offered respectable employment and adventure to women from modest backgrounds, though the work was demanding and the cultural expectations confining. African American workers occupied complex positions in railroad hierarchies. The Pullman Company employed black men almost exclusively as porters on sleeping cars, positions that combined service work with responsibility for passenger safety and comfort. These jobs paid better than many alternatives available to black workers, but also reinforced racial hierarchies through the expectation of subservience and the traditions of tipping. Railroad construction and maintenance crews included black workers, though they were often segregated into separate gangs and typically received lower wages than white workers performing identical tasks. The railroad companies themselves were massive corporations that wielded enormous economic and political power. The Southern Pacific Railroad, for example, controlled not just transportation but also land development, water rights, and political influence throughout the Southwest. The company owned millions of acres of land granted by the federal government as incentives for railroad construction, land that was then sold or leased to farmers and ranchers. It controlled critical water sources in desert regions where water meant survival. It influenced elections through campaign contributions and the mobilization of company employees as voters. This power sometimes led to abuses that sparked resistance. The Great Southwest Railroad Strike of 1886 involved over 200,000 workers across multiple states, protesting wage cuts and poor working conditions. The strike was ultimately broken through a combination of replacement workers, legal injunctions, and violence against strikers, but represented early efforts by railroad workers to organize collectively for better treatment. Subsequent organizing efforts would continue through the early 20th century, gradually improving conditions though never eliminating the fundamental dangers and hardships of railroad work. The technology of railroading evolved continuously during this period, each innovation changing how work was performed and who performed it. The introduction of more powerful locomotives reduced the number of water stops required for long-distance runs, eliminating many water station positions. The development of welded rail joints reduced maintenance requirements at track connections. The adoption of diesel-electric locomotives after World War II would eventually eliminate fireman positions and reduce crew sizes dramatically. Each technological advance was hailed as progress, but also meant displacement for workers whose skills became obsolete. The environmental impact of railroad construction and operation in the Southwest was profound and not always positive. The demand for timber to create railroad ties led to extensive logging in mountain forests, changing landscapes and ecosystems. The consumption of water by locomotives and maintenance operations strained already limited supplies in desert regions. The introduction of invasive plant species, carried inadvertently on trains from other regions, altered desert ecology in ways that persist to the present. The railroad's contribution to economic development enabled mining and agriculture on scales that would have environmental consequences still being addressed today. Yet the railroad's transformative effects were undeniable. Towns that were connected to rail lines prospered while those bypassed withered. Agricultural regions gained access to distant markets, enabling specialization and commercialization that increased productivity and wealth. Mining operations could transport or economically, making marginal deposits profitable and creating employment for thousands. Tourism became possible, bringing visitors who would never have ventured into the Southwest without the comfort and safety of rail travel. The Fred Harvey Company and the Santa Fe Railway's marketing campaigns were particularly influential in creating images of the Southwest that persist in popular culture. They commissioned painters like Thomas Moran to create romantic depictions of landscapes and Native American peoples, images that decorated dining rooms and appeared in promotional materials. They preserved Native American crafts, employing artists to produce items sold in Harvey House gift shops, though this also commercialized and sometimes altered traditional practices. They promoted the region as exotic yet accessible, dangerous yet manageable with proper guidance, creating a mythology of the Southwest that balanced authentic elements with carefully constructed fantasy. Epilogue and reflection. Standing here at the end of our story, looking back across the century-plus that separates us from Thomas and his summer of watchfulness, we can see both continuities and ruptures in how railroads and deserts and human labor intersect. The physical landscape Thomas knew remains largely unchanged. The mountains still rise in the same formations. The desert still blooms briefly after rare rains. The stars still wheel overhead in patterns that guided ancient travelers and modern ones alike. But the human landscape has transformed completely. The section houses that once dotted rail lines every dozen miles have mostly vanished, demolished or collapsed, or converted to other uses by people who recognize their historical value. A few survive as museums, carefully preserved to show visitors how railroad workers once lived. The section house built in 1910 in Maupin, Oregon, now serves this purpose, its rooms arranged to display tools and furnishings from the era. The Benson section house in Arizona, built by the Southern Pacific in the late 1880s, stands as a reminder of architectural styles and construction techniques from the railroad's early days. These preserved structures offer glimpses into lives that were hard but purposeful, isolated but essential. Walking through them, modern visitors can imagine, though never fully comprehend, what it meant to live in these small buildings surrounded by empty spaces, to work under conditions that killed careless or unlucky people, to endure loneliness as simply a fact of existence rather than a problem to be solved. The explanatory plaques and docent presentations try to contextualize these experiences, but inevitably something is lost in translation from lived reality to historical exhibit. The railroad's role in the Southwest has diminished from its early 20th century prominence. Passenger service, once the primary means of long-distance travel, has largely vanished, replaced by automobiles and aircraft. Freight service continues, but with reduced frequency and importance compared to the trucking industry's dominance. The rail lines that remain carry primarily bulk commodities, copper, ore, and coal, grain, and containers, moving between major terminals with only occasional stops at smaller facilities. The intimacy of the early railroad era, when trains stopped at tiny stations and Watchmen knew engineers by name, has been replaced by the impersonal efficiency of modern logistics. Yet something of the railroad's legacy persists. The towns it created or sustained continue to exist, their orientation still determined by those early decisions about where tracks would run and stations would be located. The patterns of settlement it encouraged still shape demographic and economic distributions across the region. The cultural mixing it facilitated, bringing together people from dozens of ethnic and national backgrounds, created the Southwest's distinctive contemporary culture, a blend of Native American, Mexican, Anglo, and other influences that defines the region's identity. For those interested in railroad history, the Southwest offers numerous sites worth visiting. The Arizona Railway Museum in Chandler preserves locomotives, rolling stock, and artifact from the state's railroad era. The Pacific Southwest Railway Museum operates on a section of the San Diego and Arizona Railway, offering train rides through desert landscapes that haven't changed much since 1910. The New Mexico Steam Locomotive and Railroad Historical Society maintains engines and equipment in Albuquerque. These institutions keep alive knowledge and appreciation for technologies and ways of life that have passed from everyday experience into historical memory. The broader story of industrial development in harsh environments continues to unfold. The challenges that railroad builders and workers faced, how to supply water in deserts, how to maintain infrastructure in extreme temperatures, how to ensure safety across vast distances, remain relevant as we consider development in other difficult regions. The solutions devised by engineers and workers a century ago, some successful and some less so, offer lessons for contemporary projects. The environmental consequences of that development, both positive and negative, inform current debates about how to balance economic activity with ecological preservation. Perhaps most importantly, the story of people like Thomas reminds us that history is made not just by famous individuals making grand decisions, but by ordinary people performing necessary tasks under difficult circumstances. The watchman who inspected tracks in dawn light contributed as much to the Southwest transformation as the railroad executives whose names appeared in newspapers and whose portraits hung in company offices. The truckero who drove spikes in summer heat made possible the commerce and travel that enriched others who would never know his name. The women who created homes in section houses and boxcar colonies sustained the workers whose labor built the region's infrastructure. These contributions deserve recognition, not because they were heroic, though sometimes they were, but because they were essential and because the people who made them were fully human, possessing hopes and fears, strengths and weaknesses, deserving of dignity regardless of their station or ethnicity or the obscurity into which they've fallen. By remembering them, by telling their stories, even when those stories must be partly imagined from fragmentary evidence, we acknowledge our connections to a past that shaped our present and might inform our future. As you settle deeper into sleep, let your mind wander through those desert landscapes where Thomas walked his morning inspections. Feel the heat that tested his endurance and the coolness that brought relief. Hear the whistle of approaching trains and the crackling of telegraph messages arriving from distant offices. Imagine the satisfaction of work well done, of crises handled competently, of days accumulated into years of service that mattered even if it went largely unremarked. Let these images and sensations carry you into dreams where past and present merge, where the essential human experiences of labor and isolation and connection transcend the specific technologies and historical moments that shaped them. The rails still run through the desert. Trains still pass through landscapes that seem unchanged since Earth itself formed. And somewhere in the accumulated memories of a million journeys, in the stories told and forgotten and sometimes recovered, in the remnants of section houses and water stations and telegraph wires singing in the wind, the spirits of those who guarded the rails maintain their vigil, patient and persistent as the desert itself, waiting for someone to notice what they built and what they sacrificed and what they meant. Good night, friends. Imagine that day in the summer of 1910, when everything worked exactly as it should, with railroads traversing impossible places, lone guards protecting the steel strips, and people like Thomas being where they needed to be, doing what needed to be done, and living the kind of lives that made other lives possible. Their story is our story. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past tonight. If these snippets of railroad history have intrigued you, if you felt the heat of the desert, heard the sound of the telegraph, or seen the stars in Thomas's eyes, consider subscribing to Mystic Sleep Tales. Turn on notifications so you never miss our exploration of hidden corners and forgotten stories of history. Let's meet in the comments wherever and whenever you're listening. We love seeing how far these stories go and when they find you. If there are any specific stories or historical periods you'd like us to research, please share them. History is vast and full of mysteries waiting to be told. Your suggestions guide us on our journeys through its shadows. Rest well until wakefulness and sleep, past and present, the known and the imagined, meet again in that boundary region. The desert is silent. The stars shine brightly. And somewhere, always, someone is on guard, making sure the tracks are straight and the road is safe for those who travel it. Good night. Good night, friends. Imagine that day in the summer of 1910, when everything worked exactly as it should, with railroads traversing impossible places, lone guards protecting the steel strips, and people like Thomas being where they needed to be, doing what needed to be done, and living the kind of lives that made other lives possible. Their story is our story. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past tonight. If these snippets of railroad history have intrigued you, if you felt the heat of the desert, heard the sound of the telegraph, or seen the stars in Thomas's eyes, consider subscribing to Mystic Sleep Tales. Turn on notifications so you never miss our exploration of hidden corners and forgotten stories of history. Let's meet in the comments wherever and whenever you're listening. We love seeing how far these stories go and when they find you. If there are any specific stories or historical periods you'd like us to research, please share them. History is vast and full of mysteries waiting to be told. Your suggestions guide us on our journeys through its shadows. Rest well until wakefulness and sleep, past and present, the known and the imagined, meet again in that boundary region. The desert is silent. The stars shine brightly. And somewhere, always, someone is on guard, making sure the tracks are straight and the road is safe for those who travel it. Good night.